All right, the hip thrust. This is a movement that I love. It's a staple in most of my programs. It's one that a lot of people maybe miss out on because the first time or two they tried it, they didn't have the setup right. And it's definitely a movement I find that if the setup's wrong, you're not going to get much out of it, and it might be uncomfortable. So first thing is box height, right? Most people use a box or a bench that is way too high for a good hip thrust setup, or glute bridge, whatever you're going to call it. And the reason for that is the range of motion, the active range of motion for the glutes in this hip extension movement here is not huge. So when we're on that really high setup, we're having to use other things to either A, get in position or just get it high enough to get into position to use the glutes, right? So ideally, a nice low box, something like 12 to 16 inches for most people is more realistic and a better fit. The other option that I'll show in a moment, if you don't have something like this, is to take two benches and angle the second bench on top of it. And it's going to set up much more, if you're familiar with the KAWS glute bridge, much more of a KAWS glute bridge style setup. So we've got our setup, nice low box. The other big point that I think people miss out on is padding, right? For a long time I used the regular hip thrust pad, the round ones. When it gets heavy enough, a lot of those are not dense enough or not cushioned enough. And when you get pain in those, in the iliac crest of your hip, if that's where the bar sits for you, it can be pretty uncomfortable and it will definitely limit the load you put on the bar or the force you end up producing because you're in pain there. So padding is going to be important. I like a nice yoga pad put into 4, doubled over twice here rather than the normal hip thrust pads that you see. They end up lasting a lot longer and they work a little better when it gets heavy. That being said, it's not heavy now, I won't use it. So in the setup, this is the other big area people butcher. Their feet are way too far away because they started too low on the box here. And now when they go to get up, we're nowhere near 90 degrees of knee angle, and I'm getting a lot more hamstring and low back than I'm really trying to target the glutes here, and that's not what I'm getting, right? That's the dominant muscle. So what I want to do in the setup, guys, is first bring my butt real close to the box. From there, I can wedge my feet in a lot more comfortably, and ideally, if your mobility is decent, straight feet, relatively narrow, where we can get the best hip extension. If you've got real tight hips, you're going to find some benefit by going a little wider and a little more toe flared because the front of your hip is so tight that you can't really hit true hip extension with internal rotation. You have to bias a little bit with that external. And that's okay, but ideally we want to strive towards a more neutral foot setup and internal torque or more of an internal setup of the hip rather than turned out. From there, my hips are in close, my feet are in close. Now I'm going to slide my hips towards my feet and get that little bit more of a posterior pelvic tilt. From there, guys, I want to lock in my midline and I'm going to hinge, okay? Meaning my ribs and my pelvis are going to stay in the way that they're oriented right now as I extend. An example of not doing that would look like this. Keeping my chest up in the bottom and then curling, right? I prefer a hinge style where it's going to look like this. And then a final note before I show you guys this version is own the top, right? Oftentimes I'll put in tempos and pauses there. Even when there's not a prescribed pause or tempo, take a moment at the top. That's where the glutes are getting the work and the tension in this movement. If you're just bouncing in and out of that top position, which I also see a lot of, you're gonna miss out on the majority of the benefit of the movement, okay? Looking at this setup real fast. Everything else being the same, guys, just a little different setup, slightly higher, but that angle helps to accommodate with that little bit of a higher setup. So same idea otherwise, feet get wedged in. That initial rep, I will do a little bit of that bridging, but now I'm set and I'm gonna hinge. Two great options. Try one of these two options that I just showed you guys, and I hope you feel your glutes like you never have before. Enjoy.